Okay, so welcome back, guys. It's Vision Masters Module 3. In Module 2, we were talking about the universe architecture, or the architecture of your world, and we discussed how this architecture looks like. You have units of action, types of interaction, place of interaction, pressure, believability. You do your universe or your world architecture even before you pick the setting. The optimal way of doing it is start from architecture and then move to choosing the setting. In real life, what you will normally see is that people already have a setting in mind. They could be fans of fantasy or cyberpunk or sci-fi or whatever. Normally, people already have that in mind, and they kind of start from step 2, which is fine. The only thing is that you still need to make a step back and do the step 1, right? If you already have a setting in mind, you need to put it aside and think about architecture of your world and then move on again to setting. And the interesting part is that when you're finished with your world architecture, you may find yourself in a situation where the setting that you had in mind when you started is not optimal, because setting to world architecture is like front end to back end in software development, right? So the moment you figure out what back end you're running, your front end may change. So the setting that you had in mind may be suboptimal. To give you an example, we used Game of Thrones a lot in the previous model as the example. We're talking about how world architecture of Game of Thrones look like. And Game of Thrones architecture looks like this. You have basic human motivations as units of action, and type of interaction between them is, as we discussed, is they either fight or betray or have sex with each other. Right, those will be the main interactions between those units of action, and then these units of action, they have interaction in very specific places, and we agreed that the place of interaction in Game of Thrones world will be some dramatic, emotionally charged locations, like a castle, like a giant icy wall, some kind of dramatic rock, and things like that, right? So and then the pressure that kind of makes all that work would be, in common language, that would be zombie apocalypse, right? It's kind of inevitable thing that is unavoidable for any character, any faction. Like, there is nothing in the world of Game of Thrones that can avoid that, right? And this kind of puts the pressure on the system, and this thing is getting closer. First you only hear people talking about it, then you see how it kind of manifests itself, and then by season 8 you already have, like all-out war between living and the dead, and kind of everyone understands that the stakes are super high, right? And so then one of the problems of last season final episode or whatever, like couple of final episodes, I don't remember, where the Icy King of Winter, whatever he's called, is killed, is that kind of removed one of the important components of the world, and it had to end at that point, right? Because that's the way the world was constructed. So you had those units of action interacting in a certain way in certain places under the very specific pressure. And when in one of the episodes you remove the pressure, then all you have is a, medieval themed sitcom, right? But anyways, it was all believable, right? Because you could make sense of most of the things that happened. Some of them will be very natural and wouldn't need any explanation, right? How the different types of human motivations may interact, like what happens if you put the brave and honorable guy in one room with tricky and greedy guy, you can kind of imagine yourself how it can play out, and that was very natural. And some other things like dragons and like all the magic stuff was also very believable because it followed like the way it should work in a fantasy universe, which brings us to the setting question, right? Because you can easily imagine how this world architecture could have a different setting, right? It could be easily like modern day America, And some people think that there are certain allusions to how the world looks like right now, with like Westeros being North America and whatever the thing on the right is called being Eurasia, right? With all the weird people living there. And also the fact that the dominant culture in Westeros has origins in the East, in Europe, so to speak, right? So anyways, other than dragons, you could imagine this all happening in the modern day America. And for dragons, as always, you can go with, you can play Doctor Who card and say that somewhere was the anomaly, right? Or some crazy scientist did something and kind of cloned dinosaurs and something went wrong, things like that. Or they could be mechanical, right? So you can easily imagine how this could be modern day world or somewhere in future. I think you can also imagine it being cyberpunk with all those factions, Lannisters would be like the evil corporation and all that. So, but what you do when you pick the setting for your world architecture, you kind of weigh all the options and you try to see which setting will help your world architecture kind of reveal itself in the most beneficial way, right? First of all, you don't want any limitations, because again, sometimes you will start the whole thing just because you had an idea about, let's say dragons, right? Again, and how specific they will be in your world. And then you kind of try to build everything around that, right? So you can easily find yourself in a situation where you already have, what you would call tactical solutions in a situation when you still don't have a strategy, right? So and sometimes you will keep them with you, right? And so if you did your part with world architecture design and you still have those things, right? So no matter what world architecture I have, I still want those dragons, right? Then that kind of brings you most likely to picking the fantasy setting, right? If you don't want to play with those things that I just mentioned, explaining how dragons are possible in modern day world, because one of the things that we also discussed in the previous module is subconscious disbelief. You don't want to take unnecessary risks with things that may provoke this unconscious disbelief, because the moment person thinks that seems like a bunch of bullshit, you kind of lost the person and your main mission is failed, right? Because your main mission is, as we discussed in the first module, is to create the believable living world experience, because that's the main value in the business we're in, right? You want to avoid unconscious disbelief all the time. And when you choose setting for your architecture, you do it keeping that in mind. So first of all, it should make sense, right? That these things take place in this setting, right? And all of the elements that you have make sense and don't provoke this subconscious disbelief. And then you also ideally want the setting to kind of help your world architecture to get to its full potential, right? So the setting should be helpful rather than limiting. That seems kind of obvious and should be that way, right? So first we understand that. Then we start picking the setting. For some people, it's kind of no-brainer, because again, they always wanted to do something like fantasy-wise or sci-fi-wise, whatever. Some people will spend some time doing that. And as soon as you landed on this or that choice, you then have things you need to work through in order to, be sure that you don't find yourself in a situation where you just have this fantasy whatever. That's the thing that kills the magic of the whole idea, right? And the whole enterprise. After you had worked through the world architecture, it had 5 steps in that, in building world architecture. Working with setting also has kind of 5 steps or 5 components you need to pay attention to. Let's go one by one. So first thing is, since we are building fictional worlds and believable living fictional world experience, so the first thing is the fictional element. So your setting should have some, you may call it what you want, fictional, unreal, magic, whatever works, elements. Something that is not possible in the real world should happen in your world, right? It may take different forms. It may be a different reality. Again, talking about Game of Thrones, right? It's like, it's obvious that it's a different reality. Like there's different world map, right? Different history of everything. You understand that it is fiction, right? And it's a very specific world that was made up, taken from imagination and kind of introduced to you, right? Or it can be like what people pretty often do to solve the problem of having this unreal component in the world. They can go like, yeah, let's just go to far future. So maybe even it's still Earth, but it's very, very far in the future, and it kind of solves a lot of problems. You don't need to explain a lot of things, because whatever, it's like 500 years from now, like 10,000 years from now, that's why it is like that. And it's completely different place, even though it has kind of sometimes maybe you can use even some nostalgic components, Statue of Liberty remains somewhere in the desert, right? Or you will have Soviet space rocket found somewhere on a distant planet in a different galaxy even, right? So you can play with that. Or you can stay, let's say, in the real world, but use the formula, everything is like in the real world, but, and then some game changer, some, again, fictional, unreal component. For example, like everything like in the real world, but people don't know how to lie. Everything like in the real world, but you can materialize your thoughts like that. Everything like in the real world, but you have aliens living among us, and it's not a secret, right? So you get the idea. So there are different ways of kind of having that unreal component to your fictional world, right? So yeah, so you do that first, right? You make sure that you have this unreal component, because reality kills the fantasy, right? That's the first thing. You don't have the privilege of being the owner of the world, and not just you being the owner of the world just because it's good for you, right? I mean, you don't have this freedom of a fictional world that kind of allows you to play with, with all the entities, with all the, units of action, types of interaction, all that, because all of a sudden, if you're in the real world, you need to have to keep in mind all the real life limitations and rules and laws and all that, and how things work in real life, instead of having your fictional world where things work way different. Right. And the other thing, as we mentioned already, if you create this story and base it in the real world, then guess what? You skipped the world building, and you have the story, that's fine, but you don't have the world, which is the main point of the business, right? Point number 1, unreal component or fictional component. Point number 2, you need to have anthropomorphic characters. You just have to have them, right? It doesn't mean that everything should be anthropomorphic, right? But you have to have like the key characters should be kind of human-like, right? Even though if they look different, if they have like elves are anthropomorphic characters, even trolls and orcs are anthropomorphic characters, right? So something that looks like a human, that has a silhouette of a human, right? 2 legs, 2 arms. You get the idea. It should be something that looks like a humanoid, right? There are a couple of reasons for that. First is humans are much better in building emotional ties with other humans. The chances are much higher that your audience will build emotional connections and emotional relations with something human-like, something anthropomorphic, rather than with the fridge or toaster or a funny collection of geometric figures, right, or whatever, right? So you get the idea. So that's reason number one. Reason number two, and this reason will kind of follow us all the way through the whole IP development life cycle. You see, we're not operating in the vacuum, right, in emptiness. Specifically in our field, and most of us will be targeting the so-called geek audience, right? So the people who are fond of sci-fi, fantasy, cyberpunk, post-apocalypse, all that. And as a business and as a craft, as a form of art, this thing exists for a very long time. Like fantasy is the longest living, right? Because you can trace it back to fairy tales and legends and myths. And even the new type of fantasy, the D&D type of fantasy, I would say it kind of appeared after World War II in a way that is recognizable as a D&D type of fantasy with all the classes, typization of magic like necromancy, elemental magic, all that. It's been around for a very long time, the concept of fantasy. Now, the sci-fi is a little bit young in comparison to, let's say, fantasy, right? Others like the alternative history and post-apocalypse and mystic detective, right? Things like that. They are a little bit in different places on the timeline, but anyways, any of them is way, way older than at least you are, right? And that means it's not a question of respect to elders. What that means is that there were people and companies that have already created something in this setting in the past. And some of their creations were very popular and they had a lot of following, maybe still have a lot of following, right? And there's a bunch of people, like millions of people, who actually love those things, those products, right? Those universes created in those settings by other people and other companies, right? For example, if you do something in sci-fi, you need to take into account that you have Star Wars, Star Trek, Mass Effect, and all that. And people they love something about those things. And they want, it's not even that they want more of that, that's a little bit different question, but they were kind of educated, right? That if you're talking about sci-fi, then somewhere there should be robots and spaceships and fucking beam weapons, and teleportation and aliens and star systems and black holes and all that, right? And super smart computers that sometimes, get crazy, and there should be some time and space manipulations and warp speed, and all that. So people are very, very, very well educated about how this setting looks like in the situation where they love it, right? So they know how it looks like when it's something that they love, right? If you do something, you choose a setting and you do something there and you start thinking about characters, again, for the reasons we just talked about, you will have a number of products created by other people in other companies that are critically and commercially acclaimed and that educated the audience to expect certain things and just educated them how this thing look like, how sci-fi looks like, how fantasy looks like, how cyberpunk looks like, right? And if you will analyze on one of the further later steps of Vision Masters program, we will definitely do that. We call it category analysis, meaning the category of the same products, the category of products that kind of look like your product, right? Or feel like your product, kind of on the same bookshelf. So when you will do that, you will find that in looking at characters in those different products in the same setting created by other people and other companies, you will see the similarities, right? You will have archetypal main hero, you will have archetypal kind of supporting actor, right? You will have archetypal villain, you will have up to 20, maybe 30 types of characters that you pretty much can see in this or that form in every product of the category, right? Things like ugly smuggler, spaceship captain, right? You may have Han Solo, you may have, I don't remember what's his name from Firefly, right? You might have almost sentient robot, right? Like C-3PO or paranoid android from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and many others, right? You might have some kind of weird evil emperor, right? It could be whatever. It could be the emperor from Star Wars. It could be emperor of Klingon Empire or Romulan Empire from Star Trek, right? It could be, like the imperial stuff is kind of very well represented and all that, right? So you get the point. You will see characters that in this or that form you will normally see the representations of those characters in almost every product in the same category that you're in. And what you will mention is that 99% of them are also human-like, anthropomorphic, even if they are alien, or robots or whatever, 99% of them will be looking like human, have the human silhouette, right? So that's important. So when you're building the world, point number 2, the majority of your characters, at least the main actors, should be anthropomorphic because that's the way people associate. That's the way people love or hate something. It's way easier to love or hate a human rather than a piece of furniture. And again, your potential customers, players or viewers or whatever, they've been taught by the previous very successful blockbuster level products in the same category that those will be the anthropomorphic characters. And again, if your goal is to be the most special person on the street, then fine, right? I mean, you can go with geometric figures or whatever, or kind of birds from Angry Birds, which are basically also geometric figures. They're all spheres or some kind of a geometric form, right? But if you're building something that, if you want to be critically and commercially accepted thing and long-lasting and making sure that people stick to it, they kind of love it, and like normal people, I mean, right? If you're doing it for the museum curators, that's one thing. But if you're doing for like normal, and I'm not talking normal, like in a way that is normies, right? Because we are mostly doing it for ultra geeks and hardcore nerds. But they don't have to be super sophisticated, right? That they are expecting things to be kind of conceivable, understandable, as people used to say, easy to learn, hard to master, right? So you have the easy entrance, and then you have the depth of, like, based on the architecture of your world and the specifics of the setting and storytelling that you have, right? Yeah, so that's anthropomorphic characters, point number 2. Point number 3 out of 5 is artifacts. Artifacts are the signature objects of your world, and they are signature because in this or that way, they have a power to significantly shift the balance of how the things work in the world, right? Think of Death Star from Star Wars, right? Pretty significant changes, right? Like removing the whole fucking planet. Think of the One Ring from Lord of the Rings. Think of getting back to Game of Thrones. You will have dragons is one of the artifacts of that world because they are capable of pretty significantly changing the balance, right? They can win the battle, right? And the battle is the main type of interaction between the units of action. So kind of something that can shift the balance in the most meaningful interaction is kind of very important. I don't remember how it was called, that special engine or drive, relativity drive, or whatever it was called in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, right? Something that can like literally get you anywhere in time and space in different dimensions. Pretty significant again, change of balance. So, and you then can play with those things, because if you have just one, let's say, Death Star, and Death Star destroys the planets and that's what it does, then that's cool, but it's kind of boring. Like you can't destroy planets all the time, right? It's it gets boring from viewer perspective. I mean, not from the planet residents perspective. So like the huge, most powerful artifact is activated very, very rarely, right? And you can build anticipation, right? And that's what people do with storytelling and all that. But you also need something to be used on a regular basis. So again, if we're talking about Star Wars, you will have artifact of the, like big artifact, let's call it that way, Death Star, right? And the small artifact will be a lightsaber, because lightsaber, you can use it all the time, right? You can open beer bottles with that, you can fight with that, you can kind of open doors, can cutting out the lock out of the door, whatever, right? You can deflect the, what is it? It's not bullets, it's like beams, right, of the beam weapons. Right, so you can do a lot of things with it. It's pretty unique, and it's cool, and it doesn't get boring, right? And you want to have things that are super, super big and influential, as well as you want to have like small things, and like the further you can stretch the difference between the most powerful thing in your universe and the least powerful artifact in the universe, the better will be, because between them you can then later on come up with all kinds of new types of artifacts. And obviously, of course, this artifact needs to be tied to your world or universe architecture and to the setting, right? So you can't have giant robot in fantasy universe that is about whatever, fishing in the pond, right? So it should make sense from the architecture and setting standpoint, right? So point number 3, artifacts, right? Things that change the balance of power, and do it on different levels. Again, another example, the One Ring is the kind of very big problem and very important artifact. And let's say the lembas, the bread that elves gave to hobbits, is also an artifact. It's magic stuff, right? Magic thing. But it's very localized in terms of its effect, right? It just satiates whoever eats it, right? And it's special in the way that you can have it with you for long periods of time, right? And so different levels of impact. Then point number 4 is audiovisual elements of your setting. And it's not like it's not about artwork or soundtrack or whatever. There are, again, getting back to the fact that we're not alone in this business, and there are and were and will be, but mostly are and were, other people and companies that also created products in the same setting, and some of them were immensely successful. When you think about other products in your category, you need to think about 2, let's say, groups of such products. One will be the blockbusters, right? Meaning that these are the products, no matter what you think about them personally, they did very good commercially and critically. So let's say they are 75 plus on Metacritic, and they are somewhere in terms of sales, right? They're also somewhere in whatever, top 10, top 20. So that would be the blockbuster. Even if you believe that, like Martin Scorsese, the Avengers are bullshit, right? It doesn't change anything. It doesn't change the fact that the Avengers franchise and every movie in it is a blockbuster, right? In terms of how many people watch it, how big business it is, right? So the other group would be things that may not be super commercially successful, but they are impactful. They're very noticeable, right? First of all, of course, you may have your own opinions about that. Let me give you my example, right? So if I would do a fantasy game, an RPG, let's say, right? I would think like, yeah, whatever. You have like the Warcraft universe, you have, Dragon Age, and you have like the whole D&D deal, and Wizards of the Coast, what is it, Magic the Gathering, and right, and everything like and Souls series, and Lord of the Rings, and all that. And you can pick some of the, well, pretty much everything that I mentioned can be considered a blockbuster, right? But then in terms of something that is very influential, but maybe not necessarily commercially successful, especially nowadays, I would definitely pick EverQuest 2, right? Just because that's my personal opinion. I believe it's one of the best worlds, fictional worlds in fantasy, and one of the best games. It was one of the best fantasy MMORPGs ever made. So that would be my kind of choice, right? And somebody will say, okay, there's no way you can skip the stories of the dying earth. Maybe very, very limited number of people knows about that, but those who know that this is something that kind of defined the way, like this stories of the dying earth are the reason why we have D&D and Magic the Gathering and consequently Warhammer Fantasy and all that, right? And as a result of that, Stranger Things. Surprisingly, Stranger Things is a D&D movie, right? In a way. Or wanted to be, but had to become a teenage drama with fantasy elements. So yeah, you have all that, right? Again, people were watching those movies, they were playing those games, they were reading those comic books, and what happened to them is that they were shown very specific visual and audio elements. Right? And it's not about like, so imagine, let's say we're talking about sci-fi. Right? You can do whatever you want with like the design of the spaceship, the whatever, the star system it is in, and so on. But the thing when they turn on the warp drive and the stars transform from dots into lines, showing that the speed becomes insane, right? And then disappear. That's the visual element that people were taught about in sci-fi category, right? Things like that. So, and now you may have it in any sci-fi product, right? Whenever you see that someone turns the warp drive and this thing happens with the stars, right? Because the captain will look into the windshield of the spaceship, which is a stupid concept to begin with. But again, you were taught to believe that the spaceship has a windshield, and you have those stars turning into lines and then disappearing. That's the visual component or element I'm talking about. Or you may have the sound of opening and closing doors on the spaceship, again, if you're talking about sci-fi, right? No one ever said that the door opening and closing on a spaceship should have any kind of sound, right? It doesn't have any logical explanations other than bad engineering, right? If the sliding door, makes a very specific sound, there's no reason for that. But in the majority of sci-fi situations, let's say on a spaceship or whatever, you will have the sliding door making a very specific sound, which is kind of common to from one product to another. It will be this whoosh whoosh sound, and there are a lot of stories of how the kind of sound of these doors in the original Star Trek was a recording of sound that a toilet makes, the toilet in the train or whatever makes, and it was recorded when you flush the toilet in the train kind of bathroom. They recorded that sound and used it as a sound of opening and closing doors in the original Star Trek. And so it's all kind of weird shit going on there, but you get the point, right? So this sound is a kind of signature audio element of the category, right? And then same goes to sounds of beam weapons, right? Because if the sliding door has no reason to have a sound, then the beam weapon, I mean, like if something will be silent, then it will be a beam weapon, right? So there's no way that the beam weapon will make any sound because it's a fucking ray of light, right? But for the reasons of entertainment, because it will make no sense for people to see how characters shoot at each other with something that doesn't make any noise, right? It will not compute as a fight, right? So people came up with a whole bunch of weird noises that beam weapons do in sci-fi, right? And then if you go to fantasy, you know that elves should have these pointy ears. Why? No one knows, but that's the thing. And what else you will have? You will have things like, again, in fantasy, if you remember, and sometimes it could be very cleverly integrated. So there's, what was that? It was, I guess, the Goblet of Fire, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. And there was a scene where, I think where Harry had to deal with the dragon as one of the contests for Goblet of Fire. And he was flying around Hogwarts, around the main building. And then at some point, he was hiding from the dragon, and dragon was looking for him. And he kind of tricked the dragon and flew away. And then there is one scene where they show you Hogwarts, which is basically a magic castle, right? It's a castle with towers, pointy towers and all that. And you see Hogwarts, basically you see castle, right, in your hand. You see castle, and you see a dragon sitting on one of the towers, and it looked as if it is a picture from some medieval fairy tale, right, or book, where you will have this castle and the dragon kind of either sitting or hugging one of the towers, right, hanging from it. And it was very iconic fantasy visual element implemented just as a kind of maybe less than a second scene in the fantasy movie, right? But that makes a lot of sense because it kind of brings back a lot of, associations and emotions that you have as a fan of the category of, like, say, fantasy and, fairy tales and myths and all that. So you get the idea, right? So also, again, there could be different levels or different scale of those visual and audio elements, but the thing that I'm trying to say is that they are product agnostic. That would be the right way to think about it, right? So dragon on the roof of the castle has nothing to do with specifically Harry Potter world setting, story, right? You can imagine dragon sitting on the tower of the castle in any fantasy movie, game, picture, on the cover of the fantasy book, right? You can imagine it. Right, so you get the point. So it's something that is, let's say, from visual or audio standpoint, iconic, and at the same time, necessary or repeatable, like this things you need to have, right, if you are working in this category. Yeah, sometimes you will have, like in action movies, you will have the coastline and maybe the skyline of some big city, right? That would be like almost in any action movie, you will have some kind of some this or that version of Los Angeles or San Francisco, or a combination rather of LA, San Francisco, and Miami, right? That's how most of the cities in action blockbusters look like, right? And as well as GTA, Grand Theft Auto, also have like the San Andreas or Los Santos or whatever. They have all the features of big American cities situated on the coast of the ocean, right? And you will have amusement parks and coastlines and financial district with skyscrapers, right? And all that. So you take those audio-visual elements, and depending on what exactly you're doing and which setting you're working, a huge chunk of building bricks of your world may be those audio-visual elements that are common for products in this setting, right? Okay, so that's point number 4. And point number 5 will be consistency. You remember in the architecture part, where we also had 5 elements, which is units of action, type of interaction, place of interaction, pressure, and believability, as a kind of check, sanity check for everything that happened. So here we have like Unreal component, anthropomorphic characters, artifacts, audiovisual elements, and now we have consistency. Right, and consistency from one standpoint is like it just has to work together, right? All the things that you have, like this, the Unreal component, the characters, artifacts, and audiovisual elements, you will see that basically, other than specific storylines or story arcs, that's the Unreal component, anthropomorphic characters, artifacts, and audiovisual elements. That's all there is to the setting. Right? That's kind of there's nothing else. Your setting is literally Unreal component, characters, artifacts, and audiovisual elements. That's it. Everything else is storytelling, and your setting is those 4 things. And so consistency, first of all, you're looking back and see that, yeah, everything works pretty well, right? The Unreal component makes sense in cohesion with characters, artifacts, and audiovisual elements. And then all of this makes sense in relation to or together with the world architecture. That's one thing that you need to keep in mind and check when you think about consistency. And the other thing is that when you go further down the line, let's say you released your product, right? You did all that, you built the fictional world, is great. You made a game as a product based in this universe, right? Or you made a movie or whatever, right? A comic book collection of action figures or NFTs, whatever. So you did that, and that's fine. And then you start developing, right? Like, if it did well, then the chances are high that you will be doing the sequel or prequel, or you will try to scale, let's say, the game into the TV series or vice versa, right? You know, like this cross media type of thing, right? So like a game to a comic book to a movie to the game, and you know, like you will have all those opportunities in front of you. And normally what will happen if you don't take let's say if you started with the game, you don't take the game as is and make a movie out of it, right? Because it doesn't make sense. It's a different type of consumption of content. It's, even though you have your fan base, chances are that there will be new segments of audience that will be attracted to it, right? With a different type of, like, the expectations will be different. Like this it's very different how you experience the game and how you experience the movie, and even how you experience the movie in the movie theater and at home watching Netflix. What you will do, you will adapt your initial product to a different content type or media type or distribution channel. And what usually will happen is that you will have to come up with, extension of the story, or basically how you try to figure out how to extend your product to sequels, prequels. You navigate space and time, mostly. Sometimes, if you're super sophisticated, then you will have things like bloodlines or lineages, for a kind of third dimension. So for example, you would have a situation, let's say that you have timeline, like past, present, future, which is time. You have space, which is, let's say, it's town, planet, other star system, right? Other galaxy. So it's a different type of, different scale, right? Which is enough for most of the circumstances, right? So you can move in time, right? So your first product is somewhere on that timeline, obviously, right?
So you can move before that, like in the past, in relation to your first product. You move in the future, right? And you can move in space as well, right? So you can move on a different continent or in the different city, depending on like what scale you had in your initial product, right? Or different planet and a different the different reality, doesn't matter. And so you will have your initial product, for example, if it happens in whatever, like first epoch of whatever, and it happens on planet X. So then you can, if you're doing a, let's say, prequel, you can move 100 years before that on a different on the planet I, right? And build all those connections that, oh my God, you know what, the grandparent of one of the characters from the original product, as a matter of fact, lives on that planet, and you know his grandnephew will eventually move to that planet, and that's they will have the same surname or whatever. Like, if the fate of this bloodline is kind of similar, they all end up in the same way and things like that, right? So that's kind of, again, that's the how you construct the prequels and sequels, right? So when you will do that, you will have to make shit up, right, to extend the story, right, or to add new elements to the world that you already have. And consistency, you know, the fifth point of working with setting, consistency insists that there's one very simple but frequently overlooked fact, that as soon as you released your product based on the fictional world to the public, and it became available to people outside your company, right? To people who did not sign the NDA, especially when it gets some traction, right? And you have like more than 100 people becoming the fan base of your product, like, so it's thousands, millions, you know, of people. What happens to your product, or to your world rather, is that you remember how we said in the first module that you take something from your imagination and you turn it into the monetizable product, right? So you took it from your imagination and you turned it into the monetizable product and you put it on the market. And what happened from that point on, it lives in your imagination and in individual imaginations of all of the fans of your product. And it's like, you know, it like it's making copies of itself, and you know, like it's like an organic blockchain type of thing, right? So, and sometimes it gets very hard on people, on creators, because like, yeah, it's my world, I do whatever I want, but that's not the case. Like, as soon as you released it, you kind of infected a number of people with that vision, right? And so part of your imagination became the part of their imagination, and they feel about it the same way you feel about it. That's the trick, right? So you kind of feel that if you came up with something, you kind of build it, designed it, you know, you had all those sleepless nights and crunches, and finally it worked, and you feel like it's your thing, right? That it belongs to you. But what happens is that people who love your product that is nested in this fictional world, they feel the same way. They feel that this is theirs. And that's why you have communities and fan base being so, you know, vicious or jealous or sensitive about any changes made to fictional worlds. This is not to say that you don't need to make changes. You have to make changes, and they want you to make changes, but they want you to develop it. This development needs to be consistent with the architecture and the rules of the setting. And if we're talking about the release product, storylines, but again, like, storytelling is not that important, because, you know, look at World of Warcraft. Like, if you want to know how storytelling is important, it means close to nothing. The whole history of, let's say, World of Warcraft shows that if you have your world architecture right, if you have your setting right, and those main components of the setting, like the Unreal component, characters, artifacts, audiovisual elements, then you can pretty much use ChatGPT for storytelling and no one will care, right? Right. And that is not to say that storytelling is completely useless. It's very nice thing to have, but don't get obsessed with storytelling. The architecture of your world and the very well thought through elements of the setting are something that will maintain your fictional world for years, rather than the coolest story you can come up with that will be short-lived, right? So consistency is basically when you enter the phase of development or changing of your fictional world or adding something to it, you need to keep in mind that you are now, from the moment you released your first product based on this, in this fictional world, you have shared ownership of this fictional world with your audience. And that's not some kind of, again, communist propaganda. That's just, it has nothing to do with like IP ownership, right? It has to do with how people perceive and how imaginary things work, right? That's, again, something that we were talking about in the previous modules, I guess in module 1, that your job, like your main job as a visionary, is to be able to describe those things that you see in a way that other people can see them, because we explained, if people can see the things that you see, then there's a high chance that they will become as real to them as they are for you, right? Or as important as they are for you. And that's the way the persuasion works, that's the way the religion works, and ideology and all that, right? Like the belief systems. So that's just the, just the way it works with imagination. So you just need to keep in mind that if you don't want the community backlash, or, I mean, I'm not talking about being nice and people pleaser and trying to have zero negative feedback, right? It's impossible. I'm talking about mistakes, right? How to avoid mistakes that will harm the whole enterprise, right? You don't want people to kind of lift off and disappear, people who are loyal fans of the universe of your fictional world, right? So you need to kind of think of it, literally think of it as if it is organic blockchain. And you need to imagine, if you do this, if you change this, will this change be, because you can't run the kind of actual approval mechanism, right? You can kind of try to figure out like something, testing with focus groups and things like that. But mostly it's a common sense, right? And kind of being aware of that now it is kind of objective reality in other people's minds, right? And you're dealing not with just your idea, but with the objective reality of other people, right? And that could be disturbing and painful and kind of suspicious for them, right? And so when you do the changes, you need to kind of be super attentive, like to pay attention to not breaking the world architecture by those changes and not breaking the rules of the setting, right? Or the way it works in the setting with characters, artifacts, and audiovisual elements and this fictional component. Because again, as we made an example of Game of Thrones, where the showrunners removed the army of the dead, the whole thing fell apart, because there's no point of, it's just a bunch of random people with, they removed one of the key components of not even of the setting, but of the architecture of the entire thing, right? If you would want to make another episode of Game of Thrones, you will have to find a way to say that, by the way, we have a new White Walker right here, because we forgot about that. He was sleeping for 3,000 years. Now he woke up and he is even more dangerous and powerful than the previous ones. And so, yeah. Here we go again, right? Because otherwise it will be boring to watch. Yeah, so consistency, organic blockchain. Your world lives in your imagination and in individual imaginations of whatever number of fans you have of your fictional world. This is almost the complete structure of fictional world, right? So you have the architecture part that we covered in module 2, you have the setting part that we just talked about. The two things that we will cover next time is picking the genre, right? Because like you have the world, that's fine, but the fictional world is not a product, right? It's a concept. And in order to make it, what's the word? Perceivable, right? Even before monetization, anything, right? If you want someone to experience it, right, you need to come up now with the product based in this universe, right? Because people need to experience it. And the way to experience it is to kind of allow them, offer them product based in this fictional world. The product in our case will be a video game. And for a video game, you'll need to pick the genre, right, that works best with the architecture and setting that you came up with and their specifics. And the other thing that we'll be talking about next time will be how you can embed the cross-media potential in your world, because again, you have this universe, you have the first product, but what you want to do during the design phase, you need to see, is it suitable for cross-media scaling? In other words, can it be the movie as much as the video game, as much as the comic book, as much as the whatever, right? Webtoon, I don't know, or collection of cards sold in Walmart, or cupcakes, I don't care, right? So you need to kind of have this, because sometimes it's the final reality check or sanity check. Because most of the times you will see no problem, but sometimes if you're hard on your initial idea, sometimes like framework or no framework, people get like very touched their ideas, right? And if you started this with some initial idea that kind of makes which you are passionate about, you can kind of bring it through the whole process. And sometimes if the idea was missing the scale, some ideas have scale, some ideas don't. And it's all like basically the scale of the problem they're trying to solve, right? If it's like interpersonal problem, the scale will be like this, interpersonal. If you're trying to solve the like universal problem, the scale will be universal, right? So in some cases, what I'm trying to say, in some cases, the initial idea or whatever other specifics of the thing that you have, even if you go through architecture and setting and picking the genre, you may see some inconsistencies or limitations if you try to figure out how it scales to different types of media. And that's the final exercise that you will do in world building to be sure that you're good, right? Yeah, so we'll talk about it. Picking the genre and figuring out the cross-media potential of your world, fictional world, will be the topics for the next module. And that's it for today. Thanks for watching. See you next Wednesday.